Hi, I'm Libby Cornish from Decadent Alternatives. Welcome to the 10th video in my gluten-free online baking classes. In this video, I'll recap on the pastry making with Baker's Magic flour. Firstly, I am assuming that you have watched some of the videos, if not all. Firstly, I will discuss some general tips for all of the different pastry types, and then I'll focus in on some specific ones for choux, short crust pastry, and flaky. Okay, number one, blend all the ingredients together. This is when I'm saying that, blend all the dry ingredients together. Even if you only have Baker's Magic flour and salt, blend it. It just ensures that you have a uniform flour when you add in the wet ingredients, and it's really hard. Baker's Magic flour clumps a lot, and it is really a lot easier to get rid of the lumps if the dry ingredients are blended first. 2, the temperature of the added wet ingredients, make sure it's warm. Having warm ingredients helps to thicken the dough, or to speed up that thickening process anyway, and you tend to get more flexibility in the dough if you've added warm ingredients. 3, allow time for the dough to actually thicken. A lot of people, when they first put in wet ingredients, they think that it is just too runny, so they add in more flour. Don't do that. Just give it time. So maybe 30 minutes certainly for the pastry doughs to actually thicken. And which leads, if you have actually added in warm ingredients, you need to cool the dough to be able to use it. You get more flexibility once the dough has been cooled, and you can. Hopefully that you saw that in the short crust pastry videos. Knead the dough. And that leads in from number 4. Knead the dough. You get a lot more flexibility. It is easier to handle. You can don't worry about trying to over-knead it. You can't really do that. And if you try to put your, say, short crust pastry into a pan and it's not working, or you've torn it, just take it out. You can knead it and re-roll it out. And number 6 is, be aware that the pastry will shrink when it's being baked. Not so much with the choux, but certainly with the short crust and the pastry and the flaky pastry. So if we come now to some specific tips for making good choux pastry, basically you want the dough to be thick enough to pipe out and hold its shape, but also thin enough so that when it actually bakes, it expands, the maximum that you can have. Now, there are a couple of factors that will affect this, and one is the water and the temperature of the water when you actually put the flour in. So that the recipe will say, boil the water, but how long you actually boil the water will affect how much is evaporated off. So you can think that you're doing everything exactly the same and the buns don't work out. That's one of the things that you've got to be careful of. That have you let a little bit more water evaporate? So basically, even if you are using a Thermomix, is the water temperature that you actually use to start off with, is that the same? So that it might say, 5 minutes at 100 degrees, but the length of time to actually get to the 100 degrees, and even taking off or leaving the cap on, you might get evaporation going off. So that's one of the things that you need to be aware of. The other thing is the number of eggs. that you put in. I actually often use 5.5 eggs. I could decrease the amount of flour and just use 5, because basically eggs are going to differ in their size. So unless you are putting in exactly, say, 385 grams of eggs and you add out, there will be variation in the choux paste or in the pastry, and that will affect how much they rise. General tip is, do not open the oven doors at the start of when the choux buns or eclairs are starting to bake. You can deflate them, basically. I've done it on a number of occasions simply because I just wanted to see what was happening. But anyway, and don't worry if your first attempts at choux buns don't look like you want them to look. It basically fill them and cover them with ganache and no one will know. And yet they'll still taste great. So making good short crust pastry. This is a very versatile pastry. You can have sweet or short crust. You can make it shorter by adding in more maize starch, so that's corn flour from corn, or you can add in say vanilla or cinnamon or chili, just to give a whole heap of different flavors. It will come down to your preference for short crust pastry, so that in terms of the amount of butter that you actually add. Once again, give the dough time to actually thicken. And remember, it will be quite runny to start off with. Ensure the butter is completely melted. And look, I even actually have the butter so that it has actually separated, and put boiling, even if it's 25 grams of water, I put boiling water in there. Don't blind bake. What happens when you blind bake in terms of putting in your baking paper and, say, rice or other beans, is that the top of the pastry starts to bake, to actually bake at a different rate of the bottom. So what happens when it comes out is that your bottom actually, the sides can start to crack and the bottom actually doesn't. The other thing is that make sure that your pastry doesn't lip over the edge of your dish, of your flan dish, because what will happen then is that when the pastry starts to shrink, it can't shrink in from the lip, but it can from the bottom. So it means that the bottom of the pastry will start to rise up, basically, and you'll end up with just a flat disc. So you really need to make sure that you grease your dish really well. So that leaves me with basically the flaky pastry. The most important thing with flaky pastry is the temperature of the butter. It needs to, you want to be able to distribute it through the layers of dough. One way that you can actually do this, if you wanted to, is have frozen butter, but that will actually stick as a frozen bit to start off with. In terms of, so I prefer to actually have cold dough, and if you live in a relatively hot climate or warm climate and really, really are hankering for some flaky pastry, then I'd leave the dough in the fridge for longer to ensure that it is actually at 4 degrees. So basically, and you probably would have seen me bashing down on the butter to actually get it to into the shape. But while I was doing that, I was also making sure it was malleable, so that when I do put it in between the, start to roll it out, that you can actually move it. Once again, like the short crust pastry, the flaky pastry will actually shrink. So if you want to make a pie, and you have your pie lining, make sure that you put, say, egg wash around the rim of the pie lining, and connect your flaky pastry top to that. So that as it shrinks, it will shrink in together. Another way, one of the problems with the pastry shrinking and also trying to rise, so that if you have it on a ledge, and it's sticking to a dish, it is actually not going to be able to rise so much. It is so you won't actually get a good definition of your layers. If you want to be able to see those layers, then another way of doing it is actually making a lattice top, so that when the pastry shrinks, but it also can puff up. And you'll see that when I made those little crisscross danishes for the flaky and for the yeasted puff, that once they are baked, the actual crossing is, there's a lot of gap in between that. And that's one of the reasons the pastry shrunk, but it also has lifted. So if you want to make say individual pies and have a pie top, then I would probably bake a cutout of the pastry slightly larger than the actual dish, and then be able to just pop it on the little pot or something like that. If I'm making, say, vanilla slice with flaky pastry, what I tend to do is cut it out into rectangles and then put all of them down the bottom and put toffee, so it's like a creme brulee, and cement the pieces together so that you do have lift, and you also and it's still also flaky. I mean, I also do it in between, do it a traditional way where it's actually in between baking trays, so that you get a flat top. But there's something so wonderful about having flaky pastry rise and where you can bite into it. So that's basically it, but it will give you, if you've got any questions, write them down, so that when we actually have our Zoom meeting, you can go, what about this or what about that? Anyway, well, thank you for listening. Okay, bye.